Maren had always believed that voices were meant to be heard, that words carried power beyond their syllables, that song could weave magic into the very fabric of existence. She learned this truth too late, on the morning her stepmother's jealousy finally consumed what remained of her patience and transformed into something far more sinister. The curse came disguised as morning tea, served in the delicate porcelain cup that had once belonged to Maren's mother. Helena's smile was particularly sweet that day, her amber eyes gleaming with a satisfaction that should have warned Maren of the trap being laid. But Maren was 18 and trusting, still believing that time might soften the sharp edges of her stepmother's resentment. She drank the tea without question, savoring the unfamiliar floral notes that danced across her tongue before settling into something bitter and wrong. The transformation was gradual at first. Maren's voice grew hoarse during breakfast, her words coming out cracked and strained. By noon, she could barely whisper. By evening, when she opened her mouth to call for help, nothing emerged but desperate, silent gasps. The curse had taken root in her throat like a thorn vine, choking off her ability to speak, to sing, to make any sound at all. Helena watched her stepdaughter's mounting panic with cold satisfaction, her lips curving into a smile that never reached her eyes. "Perhaps now you'll understand what it means to be truly invisible," she said, her voice carrying the particular cruelty that comes from long-harbored resentment. "No more enchanting your father with your pretty songs. No more drawing attention away from where it belongs." Maren's father, Edgar, was away on business, a convenient absence that Helena had orchestrated with careful precision. Without his protection, Maren found herself trapped in a house that had never truly felt like home, surrounded by servants who averted their eyes, and a stepmother who reveled in her newfound power. The curse had stolen more than Maren's voice. It had erased her presence entirely, reducing her to nothing more than a shadow moving through familiar rooms. Days passed in suffocating silence. Maren tried everything she could think of to break the curse, writing desperate letters that Helena intercepted and burned, attempting to communicate through gestures that were deliberately misunderstood, even trying to leave the house only to find herself turned away at every door by servants who claimed not to see her. The magic that bound her voice had woven itself into the very perception of others, making her as invisible as she was mute. It was during one of these attempts to escape that Maren overheard Helena speaking to her own reflection in the grand mirror of the foyer. "The girl will fade away soon enough," Helena murmured, adjusting her perfectly arranged hair. "Without her voice, she's nothing special. Edgar will forget her eventually, and then there will be room for a real daughter in this house." The revelation hit Maren like a physical blow. Helena wasn't simply trying to silence her, she was trying to erase her completely, to make her fade from existence until even her father would forget she had ever lived. The curse wasn't just about jealousy. It was about replacement, about stealing not just Maren's voice but her very place in the world. That night, Maren made her decision. If she was to disappear anyway, she would do so on her own terms. She packed a small bag with what few possessions she could carry, including her mother's silver locket and a worn book of old legends that spoke of forgotten gods and impossible bargains. As dawn broke over the distant mountains, she slipped from the house that had become her prison and set out toward the sacred peak that loomed over their valley like a sleeping giant. The mountain was called Moonspire, and it was said to be the dwelling place of the Moon Prince, a deity from the old stories who had once ruled a realm of silver light and stardust. According to legend, he'd been cursed by a jealous rival and trapped in the mountain's peak, able to emerge only when the moon was full. The stories claimed he could grant impossible wishes to those brave enough to seek him out, but they also warned that his prices were always higher than they first appeared. Maren had grown up hearing these tales from her mother, who had possessed a voice like honey and moonlight, and a deep love for the old stories. Before her death, she had often summed to Maren about the Moon Prince and his lost realm, weaving tales of silver palaces and gardens where flowers bloomed in shades of twilight. Now, climbing the treacherous path that wound up Moonspire's eastern face, Maren clung to these memories like lifelines. The ascent took 3 days. Maren's feet were blistered and bleeding by the time she reached the sacred grove that marked the boundary between the mortal world and the realm of the forgotten gods. Ancient trees with bark like polished obsidian formed a perfect circle around a clearing where moonlight seemed to pool even during the day. At the center stood an altar carved from a single piece of black stone, its surface etched with symbols that hurt to look at directly. Maren approached the altar as the sun set behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in shades of crimson and gold. The full moon was rising and she could feel its pull in her bones, a strange resonance that made her curse stir restlessly in her throat. She knelt before the altar and placed her hands flat against its cold surface, closing her eyes and reaching out with all the desperate hope she could muster. The prayer she couldn't speak aloud echoed in her mind. Moon Prince, if you truly exist, if you can hear the voiceless, I offer you anything in exchange for my voice. I will pay any price, make any bargain, if you will only help me reclaim what was stolen. For a long moment, nothing happened. The wind rustled through the obsidian trees, and somewhere in the distance, a night bird called out with a voice Maren envied with every fiber of her being. Then the temperature dropped, and the moonlight began to coalesce above the altar, forming a shape that was almost human but not quite mortal. The Moon Prince materialized slowly, as if being drawn from starlight and shadow. He was tall and ethereal, with silver hair that seemed to move with its own celestial wind, and eyes the color of winter moonlight. His skin held a luminous quality that made it difficult to look directly at him, and when he moved, it was with the fluid grace of someone who had long ago forgotten the weight of mortal flesh. "You called, and I have come," he said, his voice carrying the resonance of distant thunder and the whisper of snow on stone. "Though I must admit, it has been centuries since someone sought me out with such determination." Maren's heart hammered against her ribs as she stared up at him. He was beautiful in an otherworldly way that made her chest tight with something that might have been awe or terror. She opened her mouth to speak, remembered her curse, and instead pressed her hands more firmly against the altar, willing him to understand her desperate need. The Moon Prince studied her with those penetrating silver eyes, and Maren felt as though he was seeing straight through to her soul. "Ah," he said softly, "you cannot speak. Someone has taken your voice, stolen it, by the taste of magic that clings to you." His expression darkened, and for a moment, the temperature around them dropped even further. Witch magic, crude and cruel. Maren nodded frantically, tears streaming down her face. The Moon Prince stepped closer, and she could feel the cold emanating from him, not unpleasant but otherworldly, like the touch of winter stars. "I can restore what was taken," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "But my gifts come with prices, mortal child. Are you prepared to pay?" Again, Maren nodded, though her hands were shaking now. She would pay anything, promise anything, to have her voice back. The Moon Prince smiled, and it was like watching ice form on water. "One kiss," he said, "given freely under the blood moon, when my power is strongest. That is my price." Maren's eyes widened. A kiss seemed almost too simple, too easy. There had to be more to it, some hidden trap or consequence she wasn't seeing. But the Moon Prince was already extending his hand toward her, and she could feel the promise of her voice humming in the air between them. "But not tonight," he continued, his smile growing wider. "The blood moon rises in 1 month's time. Until then you may visit me here each night when the moon is visible. I will tell you stories of my realm, and you will listen. Perhaps, in time, you will come to understand the true nature of the bargain you are making." Before Maren could protest or ask questions, the Moon Prince pressed his fingertips to her throat. Cold fire raced through her veins, and for a moment, she felt her voice flutter back to life. She opened her mouth and gasped an actual sound, rough and broken but undeniably real. "A taste," the Moon Prince said, withdrawing his hand, "to show you what I can give. But it will fade with the dawn, and your curse will return until our bargain is complete." Maren wanted to speak while she could, to ask 1,000 questions and demand explanations. But the Moon Prince was already beginning to fade, his form becoming translucent in the moonlight. "Return tomorrow night," he said, his voice growing distant, "and I will tell you about the Silver Palace where I once ruled. and the garden where flowers sang lullabies to the stars. Then he was gone, leaving only the scent of winter and the memory of silver eyes. Maren remained kneeling at the altar until her temporary voice faded with the first light of dawn, the curse settling back into her throat like a familiar weight. But for the first time since Helena had stolen her voice, she felt something resembling hope. The next evening, Maren returned to the sacred grove as promised. The Moon Prince was waiting for her, seated on the altar with his legs crossed and his silver hair catching the moonlight. He looked younger tonight, less ethereal and more approachable, though no less beautiful. "You came," he said, and there was something almost surprised in his voice. "I wondered if you might change your mind in the daylight, when mortal concerns reassert themselves." Maren settled herself on the grass before the altar, looking up at him expectantly. The Moon Prince smiled, and this time it seemed warmer, more genuine. "Very well," he said. "Let me tell you about the realm I once ruled, before jealousy and betrayal stole it from me." His voice took on a storytelling cadence, rich and hypnotic. "Long ago, before mortals learned to build cities and claim dominion over the earth, there existed a realm between the world of the living and the realm of dreams. It was a place of eternal twilight, where the sun and moon shared the sky in perfect balance. I ruled there as Prince of the Silver Court, and my palace was carved from crystallized moonlight." As he spoke, the air around them seemed to shimmer, and Maren could almost see the palace he described, spires that reached toward star-filled skies, gardens where flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, fountains that sang with voices like crystal bells. "The people of my realm were beings of light and shadow," the Moon Prince continued. "They lived for centuries, sustained by starlight and the music of the spheres. They were artists and poets, dreamers and visionaries. They created beauty for its own sake, and their joy was like sunlight on water." Maren found herself leaning forward, captivated by the vision he painted. She had never heard stories like these, tales of a world that existed on the border between reality and imagination. "But there was another who coveted my throne," the Moon Prince said, and his voice grew darker. "The Shadow Queen, who ruled the realm of nightmares and fed on mortal fear. She believed that darkness should reign supreme. That beauty was weakness and joy was folly. She challenged me to a contest of power, and when I proved stronger, she cursed me." The Moon Prince's form flickered, becoming more translucent. "The curse bound me to this mountain, able to emerge only when the moon is full. My people were scattered to the winds, my palace crumbled to dust, and my realm was lost to the spaces between worlds. I have spent countless centuries trapped here, watching the mortal world change while my own slowly fades from memory." Maren felt a stab of sympathy so sharp it was almost physical. She reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort him, but her hand passed through his like he was made of mist. "I cannot be touched," he said softly, "except under the blood moon, when my power is strongest and my form becomes solid. That is why the kiss must wait. It is the only time when such magic is possible." The implications of his words began to sink in. Maren had assumed the kiss would be a simple transaction, a payment for services rendered. But if he could only be touched under the blood moon, if that was the only time his form was solid, "You begin to understand," the Moon Prince said, reading her expression. "The kiss is not merely payment, it is connection. It is the only true contact I can have with another living being. The only moment when I am not entirely alone." Maren's heart clenched. She had thought her own isolation was unbearable, but at least she could touch and be touched. The Moon Prince had been alone for centuries, trapped in a form that could not experience the simple comfort of another's touch. "Why tell me this?" she managed to whisper, her temporary voice already growing weak as dawn approached. The Moon Prince smiled sadly. "Because I want you to understand what you are giving me, and perhaps I want you to know who I am beyond the bargain we have made." As the sun rose, Maren's voice faded once more, and the Moon Prince dissolved into morning mist. But his words echoed in her mind as she made her way back down the mountain to find shelter for the day. She had come seeking revenge against Helena, but she was beginning to realize that the bargain she had made was far more complex than she had imagined. That night, and every night that followed, Maren returned to the sacred grove. The Moon Prince was always waiting, and each time he told her more stories of his lost realm. He spoke of the Silver Palace's great library, where books wrote themselves and stories came to life in the margins. He described the garden of singing flowers, where each bloom produced a different musical note, and the orchestras that grew wild in the meadows. He told her about the festivals of light that lasted for weeks, when his people would dance among the stars and paint the sky with their joy. But he also spoke of loneliness, of the weight of centuries spent in isolation. He told her about watching the mortal world change from his prison, seeing kingdoms rise and fall while he remained trapped and forgotten. He spoke of the dreams that tormented him, visions of his lost people and the realm he had failed to protect. As the nights passed, Maren began to see beyond the ethereal beauty and otherworldly power to the being beneath. The Moon Prince was not merely a deity to be bargained. With he was someone who had lost everything, who had spent lifetimes carrying the weight of his people's destruction. His loneliness was a living thing, as real and tangible as her own curse. She found herself looking forward to their nightly meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with the promise of her voice. The Moon Prince had a dry sense of humor that emerged during his stories, and a way of describing beauty that made her see the world through different eyes. He was curious about her life, asking gentle questions about her childhood and her mother's stories. When she managed to whisper answers during those precious moments when her voice returned, he listened with the intense attention of someone who had been starved for conversation. "Tell me about your mother," he said one night, when the moon was particularly bright. "You have her face, but there is something else's strength that runs deeper than blood." Maren's temporary voice was stronger that night, and she was able to speak for nearly an hour before dawn. She told him about her mother's gift for song, how she could weave magic into melodies that could heal hearts and soothe troubled minds. She spoke of the lullabies that had carried her to sleep, the stories that had shaped her understanding of the world, the love that had surrounded her like a protective shield. "She would have understood you," Maren said, her voice growing hoarse. "She believed in the old stories, in the power of words and songs to change the world. She would have seen past the curse to the person beneath." The Moon Prince was quiet for a long moment, his silver eyes reflecting the stars. "I think I would have liked her," he said finally. "She raised a daughter who climbs mountains to bargain with forgotten gods. That speaks to a rare kind of courage." As the nights continued to pass, Maren began to notice changes in herself. The anger that had driven her up the mountain was still there, but it was tempered now by something else, a deeper understanding of loss and the ways it could transform a person. She still wanted her voice back, still dreamed of confronting Helena and reclaiming her place in the world. But she also found herself thinking about the Moon Prince during the day, wondering what he did during the long hours when she was gone, whether he dreamed of his lost realm or simply waited in the endless twilight of his curse. The blood moon was only a week away when the Moon Prince told her the story of his greatest failure. They were sitting in the grove as usual, but tonight he seemed more substantial, his form less translucent than before. The approaching blood moon was strengthening his connection to the mortal world, making him more present and real. "I had a chance to break the Shadow Queen's curse," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "A mortal woman came to me, much as you did, seeking help. She was a sorceress of considerable power, and she offered to bind her life force to mine, to anchor me to the mortal world and give me the strength to reclaim my realm." Maren felt a chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "What happened?" "I was afraid," the Moon Prince admitted. "Afraid of what such a binding would mean. Afraid of the responsibility of another's life in my hands. I had already failed my people once, how could I risk failing her as well? So I refused her offer, and she left. Years later, I learned that she had died young, her power consumed by the very curse she had sought to break." He looked up at the stars, his expression filled with centuries of accumulated sorrow. "I have wondered ever since if I made the right choice. If I had accepted her offer, perhaps my people would have been saved. Perhaps both of us would have found the redemption we sought." Maren's heart clenched as she began to understand the true weight of the choice she was facing. The kiss under the blood moon was not just about restoring her voice, it was about connection. about choosing to bind herself to someone who had been alone for centuries. It was about accepting the responsibility of caring for another's heart and allowing him to care for hers in return. "Is that what you're offering me?" she whispered. "A chance to break your curse?" The Moon Prince met her eyes, and she saw the answer there before he spoke. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I only know that when the blood moon rises and my form becomes solid, the kiss we share will create a bond between us. What that bond might accomplish I cannot say, but I will not make the mistake of letting fear choose for me again." The implications of his words sent shivers down Maren's spine. If the kiss created a bond between them, what would that mean for her life? For her plans to confront Helena and reclaim her place in the world? She had assumed she would get her voice back and return to her old life. But what if the bargain changed her in ways she couldn't anticipate? "I need to think," she said, her voice already fading as dawn approached. The Moon Prince nodded, understanding in his silver eyes. "3 more nights," he said. "Then you must choose." Maren spent the next day in turmoil, walking the mountain paths and trying to sort through her conflicted feelings. When she had first climbed Moonspire, her goal had been simple: get her voice back and make Helena pay for what she had done. But now, faced with the reality of her bargain, she found herself questioning everything. Did she want her old life back? The life where she had been valued only for her voice? Where she had lived in the shadow of her stepmother's resentment? Or was she ready to embrace something entirely new? To bind herself to a lonely prince from a realm of dreams and starlight? The next night she returned to the grove with more questions than answers. The Moon Prince was waiting, and his form was more solid than ever, his silver hair stirring in a breeze she could almost feel. "You look troubled," he said, his voice gentle. Maren settled onto the grass, wrapping her arms around her knees. "I keep thinking about what you said, about bonds and choices. What if I'm not ready for whatever this might become?" The Moon Prince smiled, and there was something almost fond in his expression. "Do you know what I've learned in my centuries of isolation? That readiness is a luxury few of us can afford. We make our choices in the moment, with incomplete information and uncertain hearts, and then we live with the, quote, consequences." He leaned forward, his silver eyes intense. "But I will tell you this, Maren, in all my years of existence, I have never met anyone who climbed a mountain to bargain with a forgotten god and then worried about whether they were ready for the consequences. Your courage is not the absence of fear. It is the decision to act despite it." Maren felt tears pricking her eyes. "But what if I choose wrong? What if I hurt you the way the Shadow Queen did, or fail you like you failed your people?" "Then we will have failed together," the Moon Prince said simply. "And that, I think, is better than failing alone." His words struck something deep inside her, a recognition of truth that resonated in her bones. She had been alone since her mother's death, isolated by Helena's cruelty and her own inability to fight back. Even before the curse, she had been struggling to find her place in a world that seemed determined to diminish her. But the Moon Prince was offering her something different, not just the restoration of her voice, but true partnership, true connection. "Tell me what you want," she said, her temporary voice strong and clear. "Not what you think I want to hear, but what you truly want." The Moon Prince was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the stars. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I want to touch someone who sees me as more than a source of power or a means to an end. I want to share the burden of existence with another soul. I want to remember what it feels like to be chosen. Not because of what I can give, but because of who I am." Maren felt her heart breaking and mending at the same time. She had come to the mountain seeking revenge, but she had found something far more precious: understanding, companionship, and the possibility of love. "2 more nights," she said, reaching out toward him even though she knew her hand would pass through his form. "2 more nights, and then I'll give you my answer." The Moon Prince smiled, and for a moment, Maren could have sworn she felt the whisper of his fingers against her cheek. "Whatever you choose," he said, "I will be grateful for these nights we've shared. You have given me something I thought I had lost forever: hope." The next night was the Moon Prince's last chance to tell her about his realm, and he chose to speak of the future instead of the past. He painted a picture of what his kingdom might become if it were restored, of the wonders they might create together, of the balance between light and shadow that could heal the rift between worlds. "I dream of rebuilding the Silver Palace," he said, his voice filled with quiet passion. "Not as it was, but as it could be. A place where mortal and immortal could meet as equals. Where stories could take physical form and songs could reshape reality. A realm where those who have lost their voices might find them again, and those who have forgotten how to dream might remember." Maren listened with her heart in her throat, seeing the vision he painted with perfect clarity. It was beautiful and impossible, and terrifying all at once. A future that would require her to leave everything she had known behind and step into a world that existed at the intersection of reality and dreams. "And if the kiss doesn't work?" she asked. "If the bond isn't strong enough to break your curse?" The Moon Prince's smile was sad but genuine. "Then at least I will have known what it feels like to be truly seen, truly chosen, by someone whose judgment I trust. That alone would be worth the risk." As Dot approached and her voice began to fade, Maren made her decision. She had come to the mountain as a girl seeking revenge, but she would leave as a woman ready to embrace love. The Moon Prince had shown her that true power came not from the ability to hurt others, but from the courage to connect, to choose hope over fear, to step into the unknown with an open heart. "Tomorrow night," she whispered as the sun rose. "Tomorrow night, I'll give you my answer." The blood moon rose like a crimson eye over the sacred grove, casting everything in shades of red and shadow. The Moon Prince was waiting at the altar, but tonight he was different, solid, real, more present than she had ever seen him. His silver hair caught the red light, and his skin seemed to glow with an inner fire. When he moved, it was with the weight and grace of a mortal man, though his eyes still held the depth of centuries. "You came," he said, and his voice was deeper now, rougher with emotion. Maren approached him slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. She had thought about this moment all day, had rehearsed the words she wanted to say, but now that she was here, facing him in the blood moon's light, words seemed inadequate. "I want to try," she said instead, her cursed voice barely audible. "I want to take the risk, to make the choice. I want to kiss you not just for my voice, but because I care about you, because I want to share whatever comes next." The Moon Prince's eyes widened, and for a moment, he looked almost human in his surprise. "You understand what you're choosing?" "I understand that I'm tired of being afraid," Maren said, stepping closer. "I understand that some things are worth the risk. And I understand that I would rather face an uncertain future with you than return to a life that was never really mine." She reached out and, for the first time, her fingers made contact with his skin. He was warm despite his otherworldly nature, and she could feel the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. The sensation was electric, sending shivers of power through both of them. "Are you ready?" he asked, his hands coming up to frame her face. Maren nodded, then rose on her tiptoes and pressed her lips to his. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, but as the blood moon's power flowed through them, it deepened into something that transcended the physical. Light exploded behind Maren's closed eyes, and she felt her voice returning not just as sound but as pure power, as the ability to shape reality with words and song. But more than that, she felt the Moon Prince's loneliness beginning to ease, felt his curse cracking like ice in spring. The bond between them was forming, stronger than magic, deeper than bargains. It was connection in its purest form, the merging of two souls who had found in each other exactly what they needed. When they broke apart, both of them were glowing with silver light. Maren's voice was restored, that it was different now, richer, more powerful, touched with the magic of the realm between worlds. The Moon Prince's curse was not entirely broken, but it was transformed, allowing him to exist in both realms, to touch the mortal world while maintaining his connection to the realm of dreams. "What happens now?" Maren asked, her voice clear and strong. The Moon Prince smiled, and it was like watching the sun rise. Now we build something new. A realm where the forgotten can find their voices, where the lonely can find connection, where stories can reshape the world. Together. Maren felt the truth of his words resonating in her bones. She had climbed the mountain seeking revenge, but she had found something far more valuable: love, partnership, and the power to create rather than destroy. Helena and her cruel curse seemed like artifacts from another life, small and petty compared to the vast possibilities that stretched before them. "I love you," she said, the words coming easily now that her voice was her own. "And I love you," the Moon Prince replied, his silver eyes bright with tears. "My brave, impossible, wonderful Maren." As the blood moon began to set, they stood together in the sacred grove, no longer alone, no longer defined by their curses and losses. They were something new, something unprecedented: a bridge between worlds, a partnership that would reshape the very nature of magic itself. The realm of dreams awaited, and they would build it together, one story at a time. In the days that followed, Maren found that her transformation had changed more than just her voice. She could feel the magic of the realm between worlds flowing through her, giving her abilities she had never imagined. She could speak to the mountain itself, could call forth flowers that sang in harmonies that made the heart soar, could weave stories that took on lives of their own. The Moon Prince, no longer bound entirely to the mountain, could now move freely between the mortal world and the realm of dreams. Together they began the work of rebuilding his kingdom, creating a place where the lost and forgotten could find refuge and power. They started with the grove itself, transforming it into a gateway between worlds. The obsidian trees bloomed with silver flowers, and the altar became a font of pure starlight. Pilgrims began to arrive, those who had lost their voices, their dreams, their hope. Maren and the Moon Prince welcomed them all, offering them the chance to find their own power, their own connection to the magic that flowed between worlds. Helena's curse, when Maren finally confronted it, crumbled like dry leaves before the force of her transformed voice. But rather than seeking revenge, Maren chose a different path. She sang to her stepmother, a song of understanding and forgiveness that showed Helena the emptiness of her own jealousy and offered her the chance to change. Some battles, Maren had learned, were won not with weapons but with compassion, not with destruction, but with the courage to create something better. Her father, when he returned from his travels, was amazed to find his daughter transformed. She was no longer the quiet, uncertain girl who had lived in the shadow of her stepmother's resentment. She was a woman of power and purpose, someone who had found her true calling in the space between worlds. "You've changed," he said, wonder in his voice. "I've found my voice," Maren replied, and her words carried the weight of truth, of magic, of a love that had transformed everything. The silver palace rose slowly from the realm of dreams, its spires reaching toward stars that sang with Maren's voice. The gardens bloomed with flowers that told stories, and the fountains sang lullabies that could heal the deepest wounds. It was a place of impossible beauty, where the forgotten could remember their worth and the voiceless could find their songs. Maren and the Moon Prince ruled together, not as distant deities but as partners who understood that true power came from connection, from the courage to choose love over fear, hope over despair. They welcomed all who came seeking refuge, offering them the chance to transform their own curses into gifts, their own losses into sources of strength. And in the evenings, when the work of the day was done, they would stand together on the palace's highest tower and look out over the realm they had built. The Moon Prince would tell new stories, tales of the wonders they had created and the lives they had touched. Maren would sing them into reality, her voice weaving magic that made the impossible possible. They had both lost everything once he his kingdom. She, her voice. But from that loss, they had built something greater than either could have imagined alone. A realm where stories lived and breathed, where love conquered curses, where the forgotten found their voices and the voiceless found their power. It was a kingdom built on the foundation of a single kiss, a bond forged in the light of a blood moon, and the courage of two souls who had chosen to trust in love's transformative power. And in that kingdom, they lived not happily ever after, but meaningfully ever after, creating wonder and magic with every breath, every word, every psalm. The realm between worlds flourished under their care, becoming a beacon of hope for all who had lost their way. And Maren, who had once been silenced by jealousy and cruelty, became known throughout the realms as the voice of dreams, the one who could sing new realities into existence and heal the wounds that magic could not touch. Her story spread far and wide, carried by the wind itself, telling of the girl who bargained with the moon prince and found that love was the greatest magic of all. And in the Silver Palace, where starlight pooled like water and dreams took physical form, she and her prince continued to write their story, one magical moment at a time, for all eternity. The end of their tale was also its beginning, for in the realm between worlds all stories were connected, all voices were heard, and all dreams had the power to reshape reality itself. And that, perhaps, was the greatest magic of all, the knowledge that every ending was also a new beginning, every loss the seed of something greater, every voice a note in the eternal song of existence. In the years that followed, the story of Maren and the Moon Prince became legend, told around fires and whispered in the dark corners of the world. It was a tale of transformation, of the power of love to overcome even the cruelest curses, and of the courage it takes to choose hope over fear, connection over isolation, creation over destruction. And in the Silver Palace, where the impossible was every day and magic was as common as breathing, Maren and her prince continued to weave their story, their voices joined in harmony, their love a bridge between worlds that would endure for all time. They had found their voices, found their power, and found each other in that, in the end, was the greatest magic of all. The seasons turned in the realm between worlds, marked not by the changing of leaves or the falling of snow, but by the evolution of dreams and the deepening of connections. Maren discovered that her powers grew stronger with each passing day, fed by the love she shared with the Moon Prince, and the purpose she had found in helping others reclaim their voices. Visitors came from all corners of existence, mortals who had lost their way, spirits seeking redemption, even fragments of forgotten gods looking for a new purpose. Each brought their own story of loss and transformation, and Maren found herself becoming not just a healer of voices, but a guardian of stories themselves. There was the merchant who had lost his ability to speak truth after a lifetime of deception, who learned through Maren's guidance that honesty was not a weakness but a strength. There was the young mother whose lullabies had been stolen by grief, who rediscovered her voice through the songs Maren taught her about hope and healing. There was the ancient tree spirit who had forgotten how to communicate with the wind, who found new purpose in teaching others the language of growing things. The Moon Prince marveled at his beloved's gift for seeing the person beneath the curse, the potential within the pain. "You have become what I always dreamed of being," he told her one evening as they walked through the singing gardens. "A bridge between what is and what could be." Maren smiled, her hand finding his as they paused beside a fountain that played melodies in languages that had been lost to time. "We became it together," she corrected. "Your stories gave me the vision, and my voice gave it form. Neither of us could have done this alone." As their realm grew and flourished, they began to notice changes in the mortal world as well. The cruel magic that had once seemed so common, curses born of jealousy, spells cast in anger, enchantments designed to diminish and destroy began to lose their power. It was as if the very existence of their kingdom, built on love and transformation, was weakening the foundations of magic rooted in hate. Helena, who had been given the chance to change but had initially rejected it, found herself slowly transforming despite her resistance. The bitter jealousy that had driven her to curse her stepdaughter began to fade, replaced by a growing understanding of the emptiness in her own heart. Eventually, she too made the journey to the Silver Palace, not seeking power or revenge, but simply hoping to understand what she had lost when she chose hate over love. "I don't expect forgiveness," she told Maren, when they finally stood face to face in the palace's garden of second chances. "I only want to understand how you became this, how you found such strength." Maren studied her stepmother's face, seeing the lines of regret and the shadow of old pain. "I learned that strength isn't about having power over others," she said gently. "It's about having the courage to be vulnerable, to choose love even when it's risky, to build instead of tear down. Helena wept then, tears that had been held back for decades, and in her weeping, the last of the curse that had bound Maren's voice finally dissolved completely. The magic that had been twisted into cruelty was transformed into something clean, and knew a reminder that even the deepest wounds could heal when met with compassion. The Moon Prince and Maren's love story became a living thing, inspiring others to seek their own transformations. Bards in the mortal world sang of their romance, but also of the deeper truth it represented, that love was not just an emotion but a force of creation, capable of reshaping reality itself. Young lovers would climb moonspires seeking blessings for their unions, artists would come looking for inspiration, and the broken-hearted would arrive hoping to learn how to love again. The Silver Palace welcomed them all. Its doors never closed, its inhabitants never too busy to listen to another's story. But perhaps the most remarkable transformation was in the Moon Prince himself. The centuries of isolation and the weight of his people's destruction had left him with a deep sadness that had seemed unchangeable. Yet as he watched Maren work her magic, as he participated in the daily miracle of healing and growth, that sadness began to transform into something else. Not the absence of grief, but the presence of purpose. "I used to think that my curse was the worst thing that had ever happened to me," he confessed to Maren one night as they lay together beneath a canopy of stars that sang their names. "But now I wonder if it was necessary. If I had remained the prince I was, would I have learned to truly see others? Would I have understood the value of connection, of choice, of love freely given?" Maren traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip, each touch leaving trails of silver light. "Maybe that's the real magic," she said thoughtfully. "Not the power to change others, but the willingness to be changed ourselves, to let our wounds become doorways instead of walls." Their kingdom continued to grow, not in size but in depth and meaning. The Silver Palace developed new rooms and corridors that reflected the needs of its inhabitants, a library where lost stories could be found and new ones written, a workshop where broken instruments could be repaired and voices could be retuned, a garden where the seeds of dreams could be planted and tended until they bloomed into reality. The Moon Prince's curse had been transformed but not entirely lifted. He still drew his power from the lunar cycles, still felt the pull of the spaces between worlds. But now this connection was a gift rather than a prison, allowing him to serve as a bridge between the realm of dreams and the waking world. Together, he and Maren established a new order of magic, one based on consent and transformation rather than dominion and control. They taught that true power came not from the ability to impose one's will on others, but from the courage to offer one's authentic self to the world and trust in the transformative power of genuine connection. Their love story became a template for others, not because it was perfect or without challenges, but because it demonstrated that the greatest magic was often found in the choice to love despite fear, to trust despite past wounds, to create beauty despite the presence of darkness. And in the Silver Palace, where stories took physical form and dreams walked hand in hand with reality, Maren and the Moon Prince continued to write their legend, their voices joined in harmony, their love a beacon of hope for all who had lost their way. They had found their voices, found their power, and found each other, and in doing so, they had discovered that the greatest magic of all was the simple, revolutionary act of choosing love over fear, connection over isolation, and creation over destruction. Their story would continue for as long as there were those who needed to remember that their voices mattered, that their dreams had power, and that true love was always worth the risk. In the end, they had not just found their happily ever after, but had created a space where others could find theirs as well. One story, one voice, one dream at a time. Years flowed like music through the Silver Palace, each one bringing new challenges and revelations. Maren discovered that her connection to the Moon Prince had unlocked abilities she never could have imagined. She could step into the memories of others, not as an invader but as a guide, helping them rewrite the narratives that had kept them trapped. She learned to sing new futures into existence, to craft melodies that could unravel the knots of destiny itself. The Moon Prince, meanwhile, found that his eternal nature was shifting. Where once he had been bound by the rigid laws of his immortal existence, love had made him more flexible, more human in some ways. He began to age, not toward death but toward deeper wisdom, each year adding layers to his understanding rather than weight to his burden. It was during the 7th year of their reign that the first crisis came. A tear appeared in the fabric between worlds, a wound in reality itself that threatened to unravel everything they had built. Through it poured entities of pure chaos, beings from the void between existence that sought to consume stories, dreams, and memories until nothing remained but endless, empty silence. "They are the unnamed," the Moon Prince explained as they stood on the palace's highest tower, watching the tear pulse with malevolent energy. "I thought they were myth, stories told to frighten young gods into behaving. But it seems my exile was longer than I realized, and the barriers between realms have grown thin." Maren felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a cloak woven from starlight and determination. The realm they had created was not just their sanctuary, it had become a beacon of hope for thousands of souls. She would not let it fall to entities that sought to erase the very concept of identity. "Then we fight," she said, her voice carrying harmonics that made the air itself ring like a bell. "Not with weapons, but with everything we've learned about the power of story, of connection, of names and voices and dreams." The battle that followed was unlike anything recorded in the annals of mortal or immortal conflict. It was fought not with swords and spells, but with declarations of identity, with the telling of stories so powerful they became physical forces, with songs that rewrote the fundamental nature of reality itself. Maren stood at the center of it all, her voice weaving a tapestry of existence that the unnamed could not unravel. She sang the stories of everyone who had ever found refuge in the Silver Palace, giving voice to their transformations, their hopes, their refusal to be forgotten. The Moon Prince joined his voice to hers, adding the deep bass notes of ancient wisdom and the melody of love that had conquered isolation. But they were not alone. Every soul they had helped, every visitor who had found their voice within the palace walls, added their own thread to the tapestry. Helena sang of redemption found too late but still meaningful. The merchant sang of truth discovered in the ashes of deception. The young mother sang of love that endures beyond loss. The tree spirit sang of roots that run deeper than time. The combined force of their voices, their stories, their insistence on existing in the face of erasure, proved too much for the unnamed. The entities retreated into their void. The tear in reality sealed itself, and the Silver Palace stood stronger than ever, not because it was impregnable, but because it was loved. In the aftermath of the crisis, Maren and the Moon Prince realized that their work had taken on a new dimension. They were no longer just healers and guides, they had become guardians of existence itself, protectors of the right to have a story, to matter, to be remembered. "We need to expand," Maren said as they walked through the gardens that had grown wild with celebration flowers. "Not just our realm, but our reach. There are other tiers, other threats. If we wait for them to come to us, we might not be strong enough to stop them." The Moon Prince nodded, his silver eyes reflecting depths of consideration. "You're thinking of creating an order, aren't you? A network of storytellers and dream guardians spread across all the realms." "The Order of the Named," Maren said, the words coming to her as if she had always known them. "People who understand that every voice matters, every story has power, every dream is worth protecting." And so began their greatest work. They sent out messengers to every corner of existence, some traveling in physical forms, others moving as pure story essence that could slip between the cracks of reality. The message they carried was simple: come, learn, and help us protect the right to exist, to dream, to be known. The response was overwhelming. From the deepest caverns to the highest clouds, beings of every description made the journey to the Silver Palace. Some came seeking healing, others offering their skills and knowledge. All left changed, carrying with them not just renewed purpose, but the techniques Maren and the Moon Prince had developed for strengthening the fabric of story itself. There was Cornelius the Dragon Scholar, whose flame had been extinguished by centuries of academic ridicule, who learned to breathe fire made of pure narrative that could burn away the lies people told themselves. There was Whisper the Shadow Dancer, who had been cast out of the darkness for being too bright, who discovered that she could move through the spaces between stories and stitch together torn narratives. There was Finn the Time Weaver, a mortal who had been cursed to remember every possible future, who found peace in learning to help others choose which timeline they wanted to inhabit. There was Echo the Dreamcatcher, a spirit who had been consuming nightmares for so long, she had forgotten what pleasant dreams looked like, who rediscovered joy in crafting visions of hope. Each member of the order received a name song, a melody unique to them that Maren composed to capture their essential nature. These songs served as both identity and protection as, long as someone remembered their name song, they could not be erased by the unnamed or any other force that sought to diminish existence. The Order's first major test came when they discovered a realm that had already fallen to the void. It was a place that had once been a thriving community of artists and dreamers, now reduced to a gray wasteland where nothing had names and nothing was remembered. The unnamed had been thorough in their work, not just destroying the inhabitants, but erasing the very concept that they had ever existed. "Can it be undone?" asked Cornelius, his scholarly nature warring with the grief in his ancient eyes. Maren stood at the edge of the wasteland, feeling the wrongness of it like a physical weight. "I don't know," she admitted. "But I think we have to try. If we can bring back even one story, one name, one dream, maybe that will be enough to start the healing." What followed was the most difficult work Maren had ever attempted. She entered the wasteland alone, carrying nothing but her voice and her absolute conviction that nothing deserved to be forgotten. The void pressed against her from all sides, trying to steal her name, her memories, her very sense of self. But she held tight to her identity, to the love that anchored her, to the stories of all those who depended on her. In the heart of the wasteland, she found a single flower roar, the concept of where a flower might once have grown. It was barely there, a whisper of possibility, but the unnamed had somehow missed in their thorough erasure. Maren knelt beside it and began to sing, not her own song, but the imagined song of the flower itself. Slowly, carefully, she wove a story around that fragment of existence. She sang of roots that remembered soil, of petals that had once caught dewdrops, of a small life that had mattered to someone, somewhere, somewhen. The flower began to solidify, its colors returning like watercolors bleeding across wet paper. From that single restored flower, Maren began to rebuild the entire realm. Each recovered memory led to another, each restored name revealed new connections. It was exhausting work that took months to complete, but gradually the gray wasteland bloomed back into life. The inhabitants returned not as they had been, but as they could become stronger, more aware of their own preciousness, determined never to take existence for granted again. The success at the Nameless Realm established the Order's reputation throughout all the worlds. They became known as the Last Defense, the final bulwark against the forces that sought to reduce everything to meaningless silence. But they were also known as the First Hope, the ones who could find light in the deepest darkness and stories in the most complete silence. As the Order grew, so did the complexity of their challenges. They faced not just the unnamed, but other threats to the integrity of story itself. There were the revision wraiths, entities that sought to rewrite history until all narratives became the same bland tale of conformity. There were the echo thieves, who stole the last words of the dying and sold them to those who had never learned to speak for themselves. Most insidious of all were the comfort weavers, who didn't seek to destroy stories but to make them so pleasant, so devoid of conflict or growth, that they became meaningless. They offered perfect lives with no challenges, no pain, no possibility of failure, and in doing so, they stole the very essence of what made life worth living. "Struggle is not the enemy," Maren explained to a new group of Order recruits as they gathered in the palace's training hall. "The enemy is the absence of choice, the removal of agency, the belief that we are not capable of writing our own stories. Pain teaches us who we are, joy shows us who we can become, but comfort without challenge, that's just another form of death." The Moon Prince had developed his own philosophy about their work, one that complemented Maren's but approached the questions from a different angle. "We are not fighting to preserve stories as they are," he would tell the recruits during his own sessions. "We are fighting to preserve the right of stories to change, to grow, to surprise even their own authors. The moment a narrative becomes fixed and unchangeable, it begins to die. Together, they had created more than an organization. They had birthed a new way of thinking about existence itself. The Order's members didn't just protect stories, they lived them, embodied them, became walking examples of the transformative power of narrative. There was Marcus the shapeshifter, who had spent centuries believing he had no true form, who learned that his ability to become anything was actually the ability to become everything, a living story that could adapt to any need. He became the Order's primary infiltrator, able to enter compromised realms and gather intelligence while appearing to be whatever the local population expected to see. There was Lydia the memory keeper, who had been cursed to remember every slight, every betrayal, every moment of pain she had ever experienced, who discovered that painful memories could be transformed into wisdom when properly contextualized. She became the Order's primary counselor, helping members process trauma and find meaning in their darkest experiences. There was Gabriel the silent singer, who had been born without the ability to make sound but possessed the unique gift of shaping the spaces between words, the pauses that gave speech meaning. He became the Order's strategist, able to see the patterns that others missed and plan operations with surgical precision. Each member brought their own gifts, their own perspective, their own piece of the vast puzzle that was existence itself. Under Maren and the Moon Prince's guidance, they learned to work not as a hierarchy, but as a living symphony, each voice contributing to a harmony that was greater than the sum of its parts. The Order's influence began to ripple outward in ways that surprised even its founders. Artists in distant realms found their work becoming more meaningful, more true. Leaders discovered new empathy for their subjects. Ordinary people began to understand that their own stories mattered, that they had the power to reshape their narratives and, in doing so, reshape reality itself. But perhaps the most profound change was in Maren and the Moon Prince themselves. They had begun their relationship as two damaged souls seeking healing. Now they had become something unprecedented, a partnership that transcended individual identity, while somehow making each of them more themselves than they had ever been alone. "Do you ever miss it?" Maren asked one evening as they sat in their private garden, watching the stars wheel overhead. "The simplicity of our early days, when it was just us and our stories?" The Moon Prince considered this, his silver hair shifting in the eternal breeze that carried the dreams of sleeping worlds. "I miss the intensity of discovery," he said finally. "The way every conversation revealed new depths, every touch was electric with possibility. But I wouldn't trade what we built for anything. We've become something neither of us could have imagined alone." Maren nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. Their love had not diminished as it deepened, yet had become something more complex, more multifaceted. They were lovers, partners, co-creators, and guardians all at once. Their relationship had become a story in its own right, one that inspired others to reach for deeper connections, greater purposes, more meaningful lives. As the Order approached its 10th anniversary, they faced their greatest challenge yet. The Unnamed had evolved, learning from their previous defeat. Instead of attacking the Silver Palace directly, they had begun a more subtle campaign, inserting themselves into existing stories, gradually draining the meaning from narratives until they collapsed into meaningless noise. The infection was spreading faster than the Order could respond. Entire realms were losing their coherence, their inhabitants forgetting not just their names but the very concept of having an identity. The problem was too vast, too complex for traditional solutions. It was Gabriel who proposed the answer, his strategy emerging from the spaces between spoken words like a revelation whispered by silence itself. "We need to tell a story so powerful, so true, so essentially meaningful that it becomes immune to their influence," he said. "A narrative that defines what it means to exist, to matter, to be real." "The story of stories," Maren breathed, understanding immediately. "A meta-narrative that contains and protects all other narratives. But something that complex, that fundamental, it would require every member of the Order working in perfect harmony." The Moon Prince's eyes lit up with possibilities and dangers in equal measure. "It would require more than that. It would require us to risk everything, our own stories, our own existence. If we fail, if the narrative collapses, we could all be erased from existence entirely. The decision to attempt the story of stories was not made lightly. The order debated for days, considering every angle, every possible consequence. In the end, it was the newest member who spoke the words that decided the matter. She was called River, a young mortal who had climbed moonspires seeking not healing but understanding. Her village had been one of the first affected by the Unnamed's new strategy, and she had watched her neighbors slowly forget who they were, forget that they had ever been anyone at all. My grandmother used to say that the best way to light a room is not to curse the darkness, but to strike a match, River said, her voice clear and steady despite her youth. Maybe it's time we stopped trying to fight the shadows and started being the light instead. And so began the greatest work of the Order's existence. They gathered in the Silver Palace's heart, a chamber that had grown organically over the years to accommodate their expanding mission. It was a space that defied physical laws, large enough to hold thousands while feeling intimate enough for whispered secrets. Maren stood at the center, her voice the foundation upon which all others would build. The Moon Prince flanked her, his deeper tones providing the harmonic structure that would hold the narrative together. Around them, arranged in patterns that reflected the mathematical beauty of story itself, stood every member of the Order. The story of stories began with the simplest possible premise. Once upon a time, there was a time when stories mattered. From that beginning, they wove a narrative so comprehensive, so essentially true, that it became a kind of philosophical proof of existence itself. They told the story of the first word ever spoken, of the first dream ever dreamed, of the first moment when consciousness looked at itself and said, "I am." They spoke of love and loss, of hope and despair, of the endless human need to find meaning in chaos. They sang of transformation and growth, of the courage it takes to change, of the strength required to remain true to oneself while adapting to new circumstances. But most importantly, they told the story of connection, of how individual narratives intersect and influence each other, how every life touches every other life in ways both seen and unseen, how the act of witnessing another's story changes both the teller and the listener. The narrative grew beyond anything they had planned, taking on a life of its own. It became not just a story about stories, but a story that contained all possible stories, a framework that could hold every narrative that had ever been or ever could be. It was beautiful and terrible, simple and complex, finite and infinite all at once. As they spoke, the Unnamed's influence began to recede. The infected realms started to remember their names, their purposes, their unique places in the vast tapestry of existence. The Order story was not overwhelming the dark narratives, it was providing a context that made those narratives meaningful again, even necessary as counterpoints to the light. When the last word was spoken, when the final harmony faded into the eternal silence that surrounds all stories, the Order found themselves transformed once again. They had not just told the story of stories, they had become part of it, written themselves into the fundamental narrative of existence itself. Maren felt the change most profoundly. Her voice had become something beyond sound, beyond language. She could speak now in frequencies that touched the soul directly, could sing in harmonies that existed only in the spaces between heartbeats. She had become not just a teller of stories, but a living embodiment of narrative itself. The Moon Prince's transformation was equally profound but manifested differently. His connection to the lunar cycles had deepened until he could feel the dreams of every sleeping being across all the realms. He had become a guardian not just of stories, but of the unconscious processes that create them, the hopes and fears that bubble up from the depths of being to become the raw material of narrative. Together, they had transcended their original roles while somehow becoming more essentially themselves than ever before. They were no longer just lovers or partners or rulers. They had become a living symbol of what was possible when two souls chose to create rather than consume, to build rather than tear down, to love rather than fear. The Order, too, had evolved. Its members found that their individual abilities had been enhanced and integrated into a collective consciousness that spanned all realms. They could feel when stories were in danger, when narratives were being corrupted or erased. They had become an immune system for reality itself, responding to threats before they could spread. But perhaps the most remarkable change was in the nature of existence itself. The story of stories had not just protected against the unnamed, it had fundamentally altered the relationship between narrative and reality. Stories were no longer just reflections of existence, they had become active participants in creating it. People across all realms began to discover that they had more power over their own narratives than they had ever imagined. They could rewrite their past traumas, choose different futures, reshape their identities through the simple but revolutionary act of telling their stories differently. The Silver Palace became a pilgrimage site for those seeking not just healing but transformation. They came not as supplicants to be saved, but as co-authors ready to take responsibility for their own narratives. Maren and the Moon Prince guided them not with commands or rules, but with questions that helped them discover their own truths. Years passed, then decades, then centuries. The Order's work continued to evolve, addressing new threats and opportunities as they arose. They faced the nostalgia weavers, who tried to trap people in idealized versions of their past. They confronted the future thieves, who stole hope by showing people only the worst possible outcomes of their choices. But they also discovered new allies. The possibility gardeners, who cultivated potential futures, the memory healers, who helped people integrate difficult experiences into coherent narratives, the dream architects, who built bridges between sleeping and waking consciousness. Through it all, Maren and the Moon Prince remained the heart of the Order, their love story serving as proof that even the most fundamental transformations were possible. They had shown that curses could become gifts, that isolation could become connection, that the greatest magic was not power over others, but the courage to be vulnerable with another soul. Their realm continued to grow, not in physical size but in influence and meaning. It became known as the Nexus, the point where all stories connected, where every narrative could find its place in the greater tapestry of existence. It was a place of infinite possibility, where the only limitation was one's imagination and willingness to take responsibility for one's own story. And in the heart of the Nexus, in the Silver Palace that had grown from a simple altar on a mountain peak, Maren and the Moon Prince continued their eternal dance of creation. They were no longer the same beings who had met under a blood moon so long ago, but they were more themselves than they had ever been, more loving, more powerful, more connected to the vast web of stories that comprised reality itself. Their tale had become legend, their legend had become myth, and their myth had become something even greater, of fundamental truth about the nature of existence, a proof that love and story and the courage to transform were the most powerful forces in any universe. They had begun as a witch's victim and a cursed prince. They had become the guardians of all stories, the protectors of every voice, the living embodiment of the truth that every being mattered, every dream had power, and every love, no matter how impossible it seemed, was worth the risk. But even legends must face new chapters, and the greatest test of their eternal bond was yet to come. It arrived in the form of a paradox that threatened not just their realm, but the very concept of narrative continuity itself. The crisis began when explorers from the Order discovered a realm that existed in a state of temporal flux, a place where past, present, and future existed simultaneously, creating stories that contradicted themselves at every turn. The inhabitants lived every possible version of their lives at once, experiencing birth and death, joy and sorrow, success and failure in endless, overlapping loops that rendered meaning impossible. "It's the infinite library," whispered Sage, one of the Order's most experienced dimensional scholars, her voice trembling with a mixture of awe and terror. "The theoretical repository of every story that could ever be told. But something has gone wrong. Instead of containing the stories, it's living them all at once." Maren felt the disturbance like a discordant note in the great symphony of existence. The infinite library was consuming narrative potential at an alarming rate, pulling stories from across all realms and trapping them in its endless recursive loops. If left unchecked, it would eventually drain all meaning from existence, creating a universe where every possible story happened simultaneously and therefore none of them mattered. "We need to understand what caused this," the Moon Prince said, his silver eyes reflecting the weight of cosmic responsibility. The infinite library was supposed to be a theoretical construct, a philosophical thought experiment. For it to manifest physically, something must have broken the barriers between potential and actual. Their investigation led them to an unexpected source, one of their own success stories. Decades earlier, they had helped a young scholar named Theris who had been cursed with the ability to see every possible outcome of every decision. The Order had taught him to choose which timeline to inhabit, giving him the power to shape his own destiny. But Theris had become obsessed with the paths not taken, the stories he might have lived if he had made different choices. In his desperate attempt to experience every possible version of his life, he had torn holes in the fabric of reality itself, creating the paradox that became the infinite library. "I just wanted to know," Theris explained when they finally found him at the center of the chaos, his form flickering between countless versions of himself. "I wanted to live every story, be every person I could have been. But now I can't stop. Every choice creates more choices. Every story spawns infinite variations. I'm drowning in possibility." Maren felt her heart break for him. She understood the hunger for experience, the fear of missing out on the fullness of existence. But she also saw the tragic irony in trying to live every story. Theris had lost the ability to truly live any of them. "Stories gain their power from choice," she told him, her voice cutting through the temporal chaos like a beacon of clarity. "When every option is equally real, when every path is simultaneously taken, choice becomes meaningless. You haven't gained infinite experiences, you've lost the ability to experience anything at all." End quote. The process of healing the infinite library required a new kind of magic, one that the Order had never attempted before. They had to enter the temporal flux and help Theris choose a single timeline, collapsing the infinite possibilities back into a coherent narrative. But doing so would mean that countless potential stories would be lost forever, entire lives, loves, adventures that would never be lived. "Every choice is a kind of death," the Moon Prince observed as they prepared for the dangerous mission. "When we choose to be one thing, we choose not to be countless others. That's the tragedy and the beauty of existence. We can't have everything, so we must decide what matters most." The mission required the entire Order working in perfect synchronization. While Maren and the Moon Prince entered the heart of the temporal storm, the other members formed protective barriers around the affected realm, preventing the chaos from spreading further. It was delicate. Work too much force would shatter the already fragile narrative structure. Too little would allow the paradox to continue consuming reality. Inside the infinite library, Maren experienced a sensation unlike anything in her long existence. She lived through fragments of every possible version of her own story realities where she had never met the Moon Prince, timelines where Helena's curse had killed her, worlds where she had become a villain instead of a hero. The multiplicities threatened to overwhelm her sense of self, to scatter her consciousness across infinite possibilities. It was her love for the Moon Prince that anchored her, but reminded her which story was truly hers. Even surrounded by countless alternatives, she could feel the unique resonance of their bond, the particular harmony they created together that existed in no other timeline. Their love was not just one possibility among many, yet was the possibility that gave all the others meaning. "Focus on what makes your story unique," she called out to Theris through the temporal storm. "Not the choices you didn't make, but the ones you did. Not the lives you might have lived, but the life you actually chose to create." Slowly, painstakingly, they helped Theris sort through the infinite iterations of his existence. Together, they identified the moments that mattered most to him, the relationships he treasured, the experiences that had shaped him, the choices that reflected his deepest values. One by one, they let the other timelines fade, allowing them to return to the realm of potential where they belonged. When the last paradox resolved and the infinite library collapsed back into theoretical space, the silence was profound. Theris stood before them, finally singular again, tears streaming down his face. "I lost so much," he whispered. "All those other lives, all those other selves. You didn't lose them," Maren said gently. "You returned them to where they belonged in the realm of possibility, where they can inspire new stories, new choices, new paths forward. The purpose of potential is not to be lived, but to remind us that we always have the power to choose something different. The resolution of the infinite library crisis marked a new phase in the Order's evolution. They had learned that their greatest enemy was not external forces seeking to destroy stories, but the internal human tendency to become paralyzed by too many options, to lose the ability to choose because every choice is so that losing something else. This insight led to the development of new techniques for helping people navigate the overwhelming complexity of modern existence. They created decision garden spaces, where individuals could explore the potential consequences of different choices without being trapped by them. They trained choice counselors, members of the Order who specialized in helping people identify their core values and use them as guides through difficult decisions. But perhaps most importantly, they began teaching what they called the art of beautiful imitation. The recognition that constraints, boundaries, and chosen limitations were not obstacles to creativity and fulfillment, but the very foundations that made meaningful stories possible. A story that could go anywhere goes nowhere became one of the Order's core teachings. It is the boundaries we choose that give our narrative shape, meaning, and power. This philosophy was tested when they encountered the boundless ones, entities from a realm where no limitations existed, where thoughts became reality instantly and every desire was immediately fulfilled. The boundless ones had achieved perfect freedom, but in doing so, they had lost the ability to grow, to struggle, to become anything more than they already were. "We envy you," their spokesperson told Maren during their first diplomatic contact. "You who must work for your desires, who face obstacles and challenges. We have everything we could ever want, but we have forgotten how to want anything new. We are perfect and perfectly empty." The exchange led to one of the Order's most innovative projects, the Creation Exchange. Boundless ones would visit the Nexus to experience limitation and challenge, while beings from constrained realms could briefly visit the boundless realm to remember that their dreams were possible. The program was carefully monitored to prevent either group from losing their essential nature, but it allowed both to gain perspective on the value of their own existence. Meanwhile, Maren and the Moon Prince found their own relationship deepening in unexpected ways. Having spent centuries together, they had moved beyond the passionate intensity of their early bond into something more complex and enduring. They were not just lovers but collaborators, not just partners but co-creators of reality itself. They developed what they called complementary consciousness, a state of being where they remained completely individual while also sharing a deeper level of awareness. They could feel each other's thoughts and emotions without losing their own perspectives, could work together with perfect coordination while maintaining their unique contributions to any situation. This evolution in their relationship became a model for other partnerships throughout the Order and beyond. They taught that true intimacy was not about becoming the same person, but about becoming more fully yourself in the presence of another who truly saw and valued you. Love is not about completion, the Moon Prince would explain to new couples seeking guidance. It is about expansion. The right partner doesn't fill the holes in your life, they give you the courage to explore new territories of yourself that you never knew existed. Their teachings on love and partnership spread throughout the realms, revolutionizing relationships of all kinds. Marriage ceremonies began incorporating vows of becoming, promises not just to love each other as they were, but to support each other's continued growth and transformation. Business partnerships adopted symphonic structure organizational models where each participant's unique abilities were harmonized rather than homogenized. Even parent-child relationships evolved, with the Order's influence leading to new approaches that honored both connection and individuality. Children were raised not to be copies of their parents, but to be themselves so fully that they could contribute something unique to the family story. The Order's influence continued to ripple outward in ever-expanding circles. They established story sanctuaries in realms that had never known the value of narrative places where beings could discover their own voices, their own agency, their own power to shape reality through conscious choice, creative expression. They created the Academy of Necessary Conflicts, a school that taught the vital importance of constructive disagreement, of tension that leads to growth rather than destruction. Students learned to engage in conflicts that strengthen relationships rather than destroying them, to disagree in ways that honored both their own truth and their opponent's dignity. Perhaps most radically, they began working with the void itself, not the malevolent, unnamed entities, but the neutral space of non-existence that surrounded all realities. They discovered that the void was not their enemy but a necessary partner, the silence that gave meaning to sound, the emptiness that gave definition to substance. This led to the development of void dancing, a practice where order members would deliberately enter the spaces between stories, experiencing non-existence not as a threat, but as a place of rest and renewal. They learned to see the void not as the enemy of story, but as the medium in which stories could exist. Everything needs its opposite to have meaning, Maren explained to a gathering of interdimensional philosophers. Light without darkness is not illumination but blindness. Sound without silence is not music but noise. Stories without the possibility of non-story are not narratives but compulsions. This insight revolutionized their approach to existential threats. Instead of fighting forces of entropy and dissolution, they began incorporating them into the larger narrative of existence. They taught people to see endings not as failures but as necessary punctuation, to understand that the possibility of loss was what gave meaning to what they had. The order even began working with entropy itself, helping individuals and civilizations develop graceful conclusion practices, ways of ending stories that honored what had been, while creating space for what could come next. They learned to see death not as the enemy of life but as life's ultimate creative act, the final choice that gave meaning to all the choices that came before. This work brought them into contact with the eternal renewers, beings who had achieved true immortality but had lost the ability to change or grow. The renewers existed in perfect stasis, maintaining themselves exactly as they were for millions of years, but they had paid for their immortality with their capacity for new experiences. "We are the living dead," their ambassador confessed to the Moon Prince. "We continue, but we do not live. We exist, but we do not become. We fear change so much that we have chosen not to exist at all." And the Order developed renewal therapy, for such beings carefully guided experiences of controlled change and limited mortality, but allowed them to rediscover growth without losing their essential continuity. It was delicate work, requiring precise balance between stability and transformation. But many eternal renewers chose to trade some of their immortality for the ability to experience wonder again. As millennia passed, the nexus evolved into something beyond a realm or organization, yet became a living principle embedded in the structure of reality itself. The idea that every story mattered, but every voice deserved to be heard, that love and conscious choice were the fundamental forces of creation, spread so thoroughly that it began to influence the basic laws of physics across multiple dimensions. New universes began forming spontaneously, born from the collective dreams and stories of conscious beings. These narrative cosmos operated on principles of meaning rather than mere causation, where the most beautiful and meaningful outcomes had a tendency to manifest more readily than purely random events. "We're not just protecting stories anymore," Maren observed as she and the Moon Prince watched a new universe spiral into existence, its galaxies arranging themselves in patterns that told the tale of their own creation. "We become midwives to reality itself, helping consciousness give birth to new forms of existence." The Moon Prince nodded, his ancient eyes bright with wonder that never seemed to fade despite his eons of experience. "Perhaps that was always the true nature of love," he said. "Not just the connection between two beings, but the force that calls new realities into existence. Every time someone chooses to love, they create a universe where that love is possible." Their own love had become something beyond personal relationship. It had become a cosmological principle, a demonstration that disparate elements of existence could choose harmony without losing their individual nature. They were still Maren and the Moon Prince, still the cursed girl and the lonely deity who had found each other on a mountain peak. But they were also the living proof that transformation was always possible, that the greatest magic was the willingness to be changed by love, while remaining true to one's essential self. The order they had founded had grown beyond their wildest imaginings. but it had never lost sight of its core mission, ensuring that every voice could be heard, every story could be told, every being could discover their own power to shape reality through conscious choice and creative expression. And in the heart of the Nexus, in the Silver Palace that had become a beacon spanning multiple dimensions, Maren and the Moon Prince continued their eternal dance of creation, love, and renewal. They had become myth and legend, principle and practice, inspiration and guidance for countless beings across infinite realities. Their story had no ending because it had become the foundation for all new beginnings. The proof that even the most impossible transformations were within reach of those brave enough to climb the mountain, make the bargain, and choose love over fear, connection over isolation, creation over destruction. They remained themselves while becoming more than themselves, eternal in their love yet always growing, always changing, always discovering new depths of meaning in their shared existence. They had found their voices and used them to call new worlds into being, had discovered their power and used it to empower others, had embraced their destiny and helped countless others discover theirs. In the end, they had proven that the greatest magic of all was not the ability to control reality, but the courage to participate fully in its creation, to add their voices to the eternal song of existence, and to trust that love, true love, could indeed transform anything, overcome any curse, and bridge any distance between souls ready to choose each other across the vast expanse of possibility.